Morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, May 19th, 2022. This is the Podman Community Cabal meeting. We've got 3 topics on the agenda for today. The first one will be Container Lock Contention by Matt Hien. The second will be Vendoring and Release Hygiene by Reinhard Tartler, and I'm hoping he'll be here. I don't see him yet. And then the third one will be Podman API specgen create options by Charlie Dorn. If you have not yet signed up, please log in for the attendees within the, within the chat, within HackMD rather. Oops, and I'm trying to get a link into the chat. And as we go along, I'll be taking notes on the meeting. Please feel free to correct me within the notes or add to anything that you see there, especially the presenters. If you have any links of importance, if you could add them directly to HackMD, that would be great. So with all that, I'm going to stop presenting and I will hand it over to Matt to talk about container lock contention.
Okay, I'm going to link a GitHub issue in the chat for some context here, but I will briefly describe the problem. So we have Podman, and we have let's say a fairly large but reasonable number of containers we're operating on, about 100. And we are going to try and run the Podman restart, or really any Podman command that modifies all of these containers on all of them. And simultaneously, we're going to do a Podman ps -all. And the problem here is that restarting 100 containers takes a non-trivial amount of time. And while this is happening, Podman ps, which was run immediately after, is basically frozen, waiting for locks. Each container has a lock. PS is trying to take the lock to get its status. Meanwhile, restart takes the lock to restart the container. The core problem here that I've identified is that we have 100 containers, and on an 8-core system, Podman is trying to work on 25 of those containers at any given time. That's 3 times 8 plus 1. That's our algorithm. Which means that there is a very, very high chance that Podman ps and Podman restart, or Podman whatever, are waiting on the exact same container locks. And effectively, ps cannot complete until restart completes, because the odds that both of them are trying to grab a lock for the same container are near to 100%, even if we randomize the order at which operations take place. Right now, they're not even randomized, so it's really bad right now. But I'm looking for potential suggestions from anyone who might have ideas on how to fix this, because right now the situation is not exactly ideal, and I've looked into potential fixes. I mentioned randomization of ordering as a potential one. Thus far, that doesn't seem to have fixed it. Valentin has suggested potentially limiting this to 25 containers in operation at a given time across all Podman processes. That seems like it could work, but I have some questions about whether we can make that actually fair. Is there a way to make sure that Podman RM is taking only half of those, so Podman PX actually gets a chance? Basically looking for suggestions here.
Does PS have to be, can't PS be like a read lock?
We can't do read locks because of the container locks are in memory, which means they have to be mutexes. We're using in-memory POSIX mutexes because they have very strong protections against a container. Basically, if Podman crashes while holding a lock, we are able to identify that case and we are able to reclaim the lock. There is no possibility of a deadlock because Podman crashed in a critical section, which is very important.
Why can't you have a read lock?
Oh God. Because the only implemented lock that I could find with that sort of guarantee was a POSIX in-memory mutex. And that is not a reader-writer lock. That is just a mutex.
Is it time to revisit that?
We didn't write these ourselves. These are maintained by the core glibc team. So, I mean, we could look into this, but the further we stray into the deeper innards of locking, the scarier it becomes if we mess up. Right now, I'm quite happy to use what glibc has provided for us.
And they haven't done a read-write lock?
Not that
And
I'm
you
aware
look?
of.
Okay.
We could open a feature request for one potentially. I don't know how you'd actually implement it, because I've looked at the underlying stuff they're doing for these plain mutexes just to get thread safety, and it is not easy.
Also, a read lock wouldn't help us. If you have a restart going on, it would need to lock for read write, so you couldn't read.
Yeah, it would only cover certain scenarios.
It would only work if you have plenty of PSs running at the same time. But
yeah. What about we create a daemon?
Having a single source of truth for lock contention would make this a lot easier, I'll say. Because right now, the multi-process model really means that, one, we need really strong locking, because there's no way for any Podman process to know that someone else isn't going to come in and try and trample what we're doing. So the user can arbitrarily say, I'm going to run a Podman RM on the container I just ran Podman restart on. And both of those have to cooperate in such a way that things are sane.
So what was the original scenario where we were getting contention?
We have, let's say, 100 containers. I run Podman restart, and that's going to go through the containers in rough order. Let's say there's some order that returned from the database. It works on in that order. And then immediately after, I run Podman PS. Podman PS is going to go in the exact same order, but in the end, it's going to get to the containers that Podman RM is working on, or Podman restart, or whatever. And it's going to basically halt, waiting for Podman restart to finish. On
each one, then?
Yeah. So basically, it's working on 25 containers. Restart is working on 25 containers. We get to a point where restart and PS are working on the same containers. Restart is restarting, say, container A, B, C, and then it finishes with A and it moves on to D. But PS now is able to work on A, but it takes so much less time than restart that it immediately catches up. So my first thought was we randomize things. We run random order for PS, random order for restart, but that doesn't really solve things because each one is working on a quarter of the total container set at any given time in a typical case. So you run into the exact same problem, except now the containers are randomly, what do you call it? The randomly selected containers are being contended over.
And PS is sort of the party pooper because it goes through everything. Is that it goes through basically every container? Yeah.
RM-A is also like the real issue is when you run a big command that modifies everything in PS at the same time, because the modifying commands take a long time to run and PS takes a relatively short time, but now it takes the exact same time as whatever the long running command is effectively, just because of the locks.
Would you ever make a lock exception for PS?
Nah, not safely. We've got to be able to refresh the status of the container. And the only way to safely do that is to take its lock, because the container could have been removed from under us. I'm trying to rederive the logic. I never wrote down the logic for why this happens to happen, so I'm trying to rederive it in my head. But the only safe way to check a container status... the fundamental problem is the container could have exited, not the container could have been removed. So if the container exits, we have to grab the exit code and we have to record it back to the database, which means we have to have the lock. There is the potential for a database write during PS because we're updating the container status based on what might have happened.
So not only a lock, but a write lock. So you couldn't even replace it with a read lock.
Yeah, just realizing that now.
PS updates the database with its exit status?
If it exited. So basically, any Podman command that runs at any point has to check if something happened to the container in the meantime. And if something did happen, we've got to record that back to the database.
Well, you could theoretically get the status and defer the database updates for PS.
Potentially, we could. I mean, you could leave the exit codes around. Maybe it gets real gross if you do that.
Well, it would seem like you could just get the current status and then set up a thread pool with a bunch of database update calls that get deferred, so it just reports what it knows at that time and then does the update at the end of the op. I'm spitballing, but that would work.
Potentially. I mean, the real risk is that RM is, or let's say that something like RM or restart is working on the container, and we try and save after RM has done something to the container, and we end up saving a bad status because the status has changed while we were waiting to save it. You can work around that, but catching the edge cases could be complicated.
Anyone else have ideas? Paul?
Not really.
I'm not hearing much, and we've run for like 15 minutes already, so I'm okay with moving on to the next topic and just saying that we need to take an action. I have to research this further because this is annoying to Podman users, so we should fix it.
Yep, it's fair.
I think we've got a decent idea anyway, Brent, for spinning it off and using a read lock if we can, and then spinning off threads to go to the database updates later.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So next up, we have a topic from Reinhard, vendoring and release hygiene. Reinhard, take it away.
So first of all, thanks for having me. I think it was Valentin who put up this topic on this agenda, and it was based on a conversation with GZEP. I think neither of them are in this call. So maybe let me start you with giving a little bit of a progress update on the packaging. So I've uploaded the most recent Podman release from the 3.4 branch. It's 3.4.7 if I recall, to Debian Unstable, and that is currently migrating to the testing distribution, which means that this will also then flow automatically to the development branch of Ubuntu. So that's good news. I've also making progress on packaging Podman 4. This is sitting in a special release pocket called Experimental, which is an add-on repository. It's still being built on the official Debian build boxes, on the build daemons. It still gets coverage from bug tracking and other QA mechanisms, but it's not available by default. So status update on that is I've packaged all the dependencies up to Podman 4.1 and actually even uploaded Podman 4.1 an hour earlier today. So it's currently being built by the build daemon. So all of that is good news. So the reason for putting this up on the agenda is, well, as you can see, I'm not as speedy as I would like to with updating these packages. And most of my time I'm spending on, well, catching up on dependencies and figuring out, okay, so here's the new dependencies that I need to update. So I update the individual package because this is something that seems to have confused GZEP in the past. Unlike the Fedora package, the thing that I'm doing in Debian is I'm building against system libraries. So if there is a copy of container storage as part of the system. So I'm building against the sources of container storage that's in the system. Also for other dependencies like image builder and lots of other things. And I frequently run into issues when dependencies aren't completely available, or if dependencies aren't, if Podman is then starting to use versions of dependencies that are not included in the most recent release. And the instance that triggered putting this topic on the agenda was actually runtime tools. So Podman declares a dependency of runtime tools and uses features of runtime tools that is not in the most recent release. And I really appreciate the help. Actually, even Dan, hi Dan, made a month ago a please release a comment to runtime tools, and this still hasn't been actioned on. So on a case-by-case basis, I can, of course, go ahead and say, okay, let me update the system version to some random snapshot. But that leaves me kind of uncomfortable doing so, because do I know that this is a good release? Are other projects that are using the same version? Does that make sense? Is that, I mean, in many cases, it might make sense. For the Podman 4.1 release, I've run into similar issues actually with specs image, where in the past I got away with reverting specific patches in Podman that use features that are not available in the most recent release of image spec. But for 4.1, I decided then to just go ahead and package exactly that snapshot. And now I need to look for what else might break and get this into unstable. So that's what I'm spending a lot of time, and this is why this made it up onto the agenda. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this.
So Reinhard, they still haven't merged that. They haven't released a new version yet, right?
Runtime tool have not. I have a similar request also for image spec.
Yeah. All right. I will at least ping the people inside of Red Hat who have merge capabilities there to see if they can move it forward.
Thank you.
Yeah. The problem in both of those repos is the primary people who were put in there have gone on to other jobs and have lost their focus on it. So we're slowly trying to get more Red Hat people involved in there so we can move it forward. But we also have to watch out to make sure we're not trying to bully the market.
Oh, I mean, as you can tell, I'm currently at work myself, and I totally resonate with these things, because if you start touching projects that are not in your teams, then you suddenly end up with owning it.
Right.
I'm totally aware of these dynamics. So a reasonable question you might ask is, why isn't Podman 4.1 in unstable yet? So there are basically two challenges. First of all, I'm busy with dealing with nonsense like this, with finding out what dependency need to be updated. The other thing that I still didn't get around to is write like a good upgrade guide. So, okay, if you're upgrading now from Podman 3 or from Podman 4.0 to 4.1, so what are the things to watch out for? These are a couple of things that I'd like to go through your release notes and see how I can edit and format them in a way that is digestible to system administrators that might not be familiar to container technology as much as we would like. And for me, this is now a question to you. How strongly do you recommend of using NetAwork? NetAwork is a package that is not currently in Debian. It's written in Rust. I looked at packaging it in Debian, but it's not something that I'm intimately familiar with, and requires more attention of mine to become familiar and package the additional dependency. So in short, that dependency isn't available in Debian. How do you guys feel about having Podman 4.1 in Debian without NetAwork?
Not very good.
That's what I thought.
The problem is that, well, a couple of things. The new networks faster, which I think people would appreciate. But there is no development, and one could even claim very little bug fixing going on in CNI. So that to me sort of bears an ugly head there. Theoretically, technically, nothing would break. You could do such a thing if you chose to, but I think that you'd be kind of working yourself into a corner that you can't get out of.
Right. So it seems my intuition is right. Let me focus first on the upgrade path and on network. We prioritize that over having that in Debian unstable. If you would find volunteers, if I see frequently users asking for newer releases, even in the upstream Podman GitHub issue tracker, look, I'm also just a volunteer and doing that in my spare time. So if people would like to help out, many of these tasks are actually quite easy to do.
I guess we could update the official installation docs. Like if you want to help out with Debian packaging, reach out to Reinhard.
Sure. So
Also,
Yeah.
the way how it's organized, sorry, just a sec. The way how it's organized in Debian, we have a Golang packaging team, and most of the container stuff is in that Golang packaging team. So it's technically not just me, but granting access to the Git repositories on Salsa, which is a Debian-specific instance of GitLab. That is absolutely not a problem, even to non-Debian developers.
So is the Go packaging team okay with working with beginners, or do you want to establish Debian packagers? Okay.
No, absolutely. This is open for beginners of all levels of expertise.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
I was just going to say that Tom could also send out a blast to our mailing lists, or you're just as welcome to, Reinhard, as well, that we're looking for help, and see if we can get anyone interested. You are right, though. It's a frequent topic.
I would love to help, and I do think that I'm on the right track. Again, these release hygiene things is something that, if you could help me with making sure that to avoid unreleased dependencies, that's good. Truth to be told, the Podman package in Debian does include a number of vendored libraries, which aren't available as system libraries. I prefer to keep it to a minimum. Truth to be told is introducing new libraries in Debian is slower than I'd like it to be. So this is more of a shortcut that we can do, but it comes with trade-offs that I'd rather avoid. So then, if you don't mind, I'd then point you to the other GitHub issue with the image spec that has a similar issue with the release.
Yeah, are you putting the links in, or you just add links to Tom's document?
I can do that, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I will do my best to wind them to a release.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, thanks for your opinion on network.
Yeah, I would say, as far as the other thing, as we add new features, they're going to be added to NetArc and Aardvark DNS. So eventually people are going to say, this is broken on Debian, or they can't get it. So there's going to be more and more complaints going forward about features that people want.
Right. Any further questions or comments, thoughts? Volunteers, best of all. Okay. Not hearing any at the moment, so we will move on, and we'll ask Charlie Dorn to talk about Podman API specgen create options. Charlie, take it away.
I'm going to try to share my screen, see if it wants to cooperate.
We'll keep the fingers crossed.
It does want to cooperate. That's good. Okay. I just made some slides to kind of like help me talk through the different issues, because this has been something that's been nagging me for a while. So last summer I redesigned the infra container process. Infra container for pods used to be created in a separate path than regular containers go through. So I kind of rewired it to be a regular container, which means that the infra container automatically receives a lot of the pod create options, because most of them are actually just container options that are infra specific, which means a lot of these are filled out in a container spec inside of CMD Podman, which is the top layer before any remote calls are handled. So Podman remote, and especially just direct calls to the socket, those happen after CMD Podman, which means that we can't marshal the infraspec because it would just pass too many untested options to users. So they would have an entire spec gen for the infra container exposed to the API if we marshaled it, which obviously we don't want. Which means that all of the infra container like parsing of options and like mapping and filling out of the spec gen basically has to be thrown away and redone inside of the API path, because the type for that is a pod spec generator, which means rather than create options, which is kind of my question. It's more of a question because I'm thinking there has to be a reason that the API uses a spec gen rather than create options, because I just kind of threw in a quick example under here. The native Podman CLI just has basic flags like CPUs equals 5 is the equivalent of, in the API, passing resource limits CPU quota 50,000. So I was just kind of wondering if there's a specific reason, or if we're really attached to having spec gen, because it definitely is more complicated and involves this entire redefinition process in a way. I'm just kind of, I've been wondering for a while if it's even viable for pods and containers to switch the API to take create options in like a JSON format rather than a spec gen in a JSON format.
SpecGen, for reference, was originally designed for the API.
Yeah.
I recall Brent was trying to use an older structure, and I said, oh God, let's not do this. We need something new. And I actually had a prototype of something that had been kicking around, and that turned into SpecGen. So it was designed from the ground up for consumption via JSON API. It's definitely more complicated than just the create options, but that was sort of the intent. We were trying to offload as much as possible of the parsing of the basically the front end work, what I consider to be the front end work. We didn't want it to be done by the server. We wanted to do as little as possible in the server.
Yeah, I think sort of the line of thinking is that if you're using the API to create a container, you're an expert, and SpecGen really does actually allow you to do more customization, if you will, than command line. So there are some benefits. We're also sort of following the Docker model here, in that we pass essentially the construct that ends up being the container, as opposed to the options that could go into it.
Okay. Yeah, I assumed that it was made for this because it just looks like it's basically a JSON format being marshaled and unmarshaled. I'm just wondering if the whole intent of the API and SpecGen is assuming that the person knows what they're doing, should we then, to fix this problem, allow, because right now, like in the JSON tags, the infra container spec is like the dash, which means it's not marshaled or unmarshaled. It's basically ignored. Should we allow that to be modified and let people break it if they want to? And then inside of the API, obviously fill it with sane defaults if they aren't there to begin with. Because that would fix this. Because if you pass like infra name equals foo, I can marshal that to the API, unmarshal it into a spec on that side of things. And then if they don't give me the same defaults that are filled in the CMD, like define create options, I can do that there. And that would fix this, because right now what I do is in CMD, infra gets filled out, and if you're doing native, it works perfectly, the spec. But if you're doing a remote call, I basically have to map all the options back to the pod specgen and then redo it later. So it's like a duplication of the same chunk. So having some way, whether that's allowing users to access infra spec in the API, or making like a separate remote specgen or something like that, just so that there's not this bulk that if you read the code in like CMD Podman, it's confusing as to like why it gets totally filled out, but then you have to map it back to a pod specgen. So that I'm just looking for some sort of solution to this. If there's none, I guess there's none.
So my concern with sending the infra isn't that the user fills in like broken values. It's more that currently the pod spec and the infra, like the container spec, which is included in the pod spec, have like duplicated attributes. Like the network information and all this stuff is essentially in both. But what you want, like as an API user, why are there two fields doing the same thing? That doesn't make sense. So what we need would be a single source of truth. So okay. if you want I would be fine with having the container spec in there for the infra container, but then you would need to remove the redundant attributes from the pod spec. So these attributes,
which honestly, that kind of makes sense, removing them from the pod spec, because they're all infra, like they're handled by the infra container. Right. So I guess that is a solution if people are okay with that.
I'm generally on board with that. This is getting 5.0 vibes from me because this sounds like API changes.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good middle ground, because my idea was to make create options, which I knew would probably get shot down immediately just because it's less versatile, and specgen is just lets you do more things. And my other option was making a new struct, which is also just more code, which would be annoying and just used for remote. So having this, opening the infra spec, but deleting the duplicate options, I think is a good middle ground. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Paul, were you saying, were you going with actually removing, or that there would be a defined technique for merging them such that one just overwrites the other?
No, I would remove the fields that are redundant from the pod spec and then use them in the infra spec.
Okay.
What are we doing now if they conflict?
Infra isn't able to be accessed if you do like this see like this curl call here. Like if someone was to put in like infra underscore spec, it would just not recognize that as a tag. So basically what it does is it just goes through the same process that CMD Podman does to create the infra specgen, but again with the pod spec that's given. So there's no conflicting that can actually occur at the moment. We just ignore infra spec, which is kind of the problem, is because it just gets thrown out in the trash if it's already filled, which revealing that, and like, so the pod specgen has resource limits, and so does the infra specgen. So you'd remove them from the pod specgen and give them to infra, because infra is the container that actually handles the resource limits. The pod just kind of holds them and gives them to infra when needed.
But going forward, we want to just have infraspec, right?
Yeah. So we're going to remove the resource limits, for example, from the pod spec and expose the infraspec to the API so that people can just directly access that. And you wouldn't have to, I forget how it works. You might have to put, the only annoying thing was that people would have to learn to put like infra spec as like another element in their JSON that they're passing, and then resource limits would go within that. I'm pretty sure, which is why it would be 5.0, because it would be a weird change.
Okay.
We can also talk about this more if I start it and it's just weird, and we need to revisit the whole issue.
The problem is the 5 is a year away. So
yeah.
So the question is, when can we start putting this in? Well, it's the year we released 4 in December, right? So
it's excellent job security, Dan.
But we released in January, so the next time we do a major release would be January again. So I guess we're not that far away from being able to start this.
Which January, Dan?
Which
next
January?
year or in 10 years? I'm all in favor of not releasing major or not having a major release per year.
But one of the things, this is an API, right? So there was discussion. I was discussing yesterday with somebody that was complaining about us breaking API so that Podman 3 couldn't talk to a Podman 4 server.
You're talking about the versioning.
Versioning. So could we do this sooner and just version the API so that the Podman 4 API worked, but this would be the Podman 5 API? And could that be released sooner than we bump Podman? Because it's a new feature, right? It's just a new API.
Well, we'd have to retain all the code that we actually wanted to get rid of in that case. Although this would let us get the new stuff in quicker. We just have to retain the old stuff.
I'm arguing going forward that we can't just break the -1 version to the current version of the API. And maybe we could break -2, but going forward, we can't be just, this is what we see every time. Well, we see the reverse.
This is probably what Charlie should be working on now.
Yeah,
is to eliminate that, and then he can do his work
right
behind that. I would want to work with John to lay out how that should look and the design of it, because this is kind of his expertise area, and then we could implement it.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm pointing out here is that every time we release a new version of Podman right now, we go through this scramble to try to figure out how to get the server up to date with the client. And we have to fix that problem, because the Mac, someone goes and builds Podman on a Mac before we have it on the server side, and we have issues.
That would imply that the version of the remote API is then detached from the client version, which currently is not.
I think that we would continue to lockstep the client and remote API versions. We just have the client accept remote API version N-1 or maybe N-2 as well.
Right.
We would have to keep the parsing logic for the old versions. I've seen some of what Docker did to maintain that. It's not pretty, but I think it's doable, and I think it's necessary.
It's a bona fide nightmare, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But it's something we could do.
Yeah. What we're talking about is an engineering problem when we have a user problem, right? The users get screwed. And going back to Reinhardt's talk, you have distributions like Debian that are reticent to update quickly, and suddenly they're talking to servers that are newer, and everything gets botched up. This is why we just stuck to the API now. It's stuck to the command line. We wouldn't have this issue. But we have an API now, so we have to start treating it like a full API.
My question is, if you plop, like InfraSpec is inside of the pod spec. So I'm kind of blanking on how this works, but is it necessary when you're putting data in like this to specify, like, do I have to put InfraSpec and then another bracket and then resource limits, or will the syntax technically stay the same? Because the issue is that there's duplicates. So if I remove one duplicate and expose the other, wouldn't the syntax technically be the same in for most use cases? But now, of course, if you've been specifying like pod resource limits, which is what these are within, you have to switch that to InfraSpec. But most use cases, no one's doing that. Everyone's just putting resource limits, CPU quota. So that would technically stay the same. So it would be, if I could get this to work in the way that I'm thinking, it would of course be a syntax change for some use cases, but for the majority of people, it wouldn't break everything. But there would still have to be some sort of translation.
I think that's possible, but you'd have to embed the specgen struct into the pod spec generator struct, which could get ugly if there are conflicting fields. I don't actually know how that works if there are conflicting fields.
That's where it is now. But it's just hidden because there's too much conflict.
If they are conflicting fields, it should use from the parent struct basically, and not the embedded one.
But don't we want to get to the point where we're not embedding it? It's just that is the struct that you pass back and forth.
Yeah, we could probably get to that point.
Because a pod spec should just be a hierarchy. It should just be a container spec with additional fields, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and infra can just become that because infra is only used for pods. So this is probably like a twofold thing that needs to happen. We need to like alter infra by adding some things that are currently in the pod spec that don't need to be in a pod spec and can just be in infra. And also change the API to manage it better.
Right, questions or thoughts, Charlie? Are you all set?
I think I'm all set if no one else has any questions about it.
Okay. Not hearing any questions right now. That is all. We have time for open questions and comments that they want to raise. Dan, do you, or Brent, do you have any announcements or things you want to talk about?
No, there's 4.1 went out. What was it now 2 weeks ago? And we haven't even talked about a 4.2 time frame. So
yeah, we are looking for major features for Podman 4.2. We're beginning to talk about those. So, for instance, one of the topics, one of the key features will be better Podman Play Kube functionality or support. So we're sort of putting a concentration on that. We have a concentration on working on SigStore. I don't know if that'll be in 4.2 or 4.3. And then we have better support for continuing to work on the Podman machine interface for Mac and Windows. And perhaps the first release of Podman Desktop, although that isn't tied to 4.2, but hopefully we'll be able to get something out there.
For a bit of further context, I'm expecting a 4.1.1 at some point in about 2 weeks from now, I would say. The team is going to be doing a bug fix week over the next few weeks. basically we're going to hit to-dos and then we're going to hit bugs over the following 2 weeks. So some point after those, I'm expecting a 4.1.1 release with all those accumulated fixes included.
Works out roughly early June, right, Matt?
Yes, early June.
Right. Any other questions, topics?
Lunchtime?
Yeah, it's getting close to. All right. I'll just have a reminder that we do have a community meeting coming up on Tuesday, June 7th. So if anybody has anything that they would like to demo that's related to Podman or any of the other container tools, we'd love to see that. Please contact me. Or if you have some thoughts of things that you'd like to see that I might be able to chase down from other people. And then as far as the Cabal meeting goes, we will be having the next one on Thursday, June 16th. I will not be here, so somebody will have to run that for me. I'll be enjoying some PTO that week, and I'll figure out who that will be. And again, if you have any topics for that one or any other future meetings that we hold for the community, please let me know. And unless anybody has any last thoughts or questions, I say let's go get some lunch, and thank you for attending today. Righto. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.